Good evening. Welcome back to Capital Tonight, a statewide look at politics. I'm Tim Boyum. It's Wednesday, time for the advocates, the folks whose job it is to research topics we talk about each and every night. Tonight we're joined by Brian Lewis with New Frame, a consulting and lobbying firm. Donald Bryson heads up the North Carolina chapter for Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the program, sir. Great bow tie, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Very dapper. All right, we're trying to get past these elections and move forward, but I do want to ask one question, because you guys were both working on some campaign issues behind the scenes. We saw $100 million plus in TV ads, and they really didn't move the needle much. But you, in particular, your group, did a ton of door-to-door and knocking on doors, which is really old-school politics.
Right.
And is it making a comeback as far as its importance?
I believe it is, particularly in North Carolina. We did 1.1 million phone calls this year and knocked on just over 200,000 doors, which is a lot of doors if you're doing it yourself. That's a lot of physical labor. But it's a lot of targeting voters on specific issues, and North Carolina is increasing in national importance as far as elections goes. We're moving primary dates up. We're going to be more important in presidential years, and everybody includes us as a swing state. And so politics, instead of just blowing ads all over the air, are going to be a lot more retail, a lot more targeted to the individual voter. And we went and talked to people about energy, health care, and spending, and we did it at the door, and we feel like we were really successful.
You agree?
You know, I think Donald's right. I mean, it's all about getting your folks to the polls. But if you got to look at it historically too, Tim. I mean, since the Civil War, midterm elections, the party in power in the White House takes a shellacking in midterm elections. Only 3 years that hasn't happened: 1934, 1998, 2002. Other than that, the party in power in the White House, they lose. And I think that happened here in North Carolina. You could even make the argument that maybe Democrats did better than expected. I do think knocking on doors, that kind of stuff works, but we really only had 44% turnout, and we always have around 44% turnout.
So you're saying in some ways it didn't matter what anybody did, it was going to happen the way it happened?
I think this year's election is about the people who vote on personality don't go out to the polls. Just under George W. Bush's term in 2006 it was, he took a shellacking in Congress because the people who voted for George W. Bush in 2004 just didn't come to the polls. And it's a problem with Democrats. I think it's a bigger problem with Democrats. They vote on personality. You got about a third of the electorate. They just vote on the person, and they're not voting on the issues. And Democrats have just got to figure out a way to get their people to the polls and vote issues year after year.
I disagree with that to an extent. I think, inevitably in midterm elections you're going to have lower turnout, which means that you're going to start having to win at the margins. Yeah. And the way you win at the margins is to get your ground game up. And that's what conservatives figured out how to do this year for the first time in a long time, because we've always been terrible at it, and I think we did a good job this year.
All right, so we have a lot of people have been talking about it big time publicly, but we have a House Speaker race now that Tom Tillis is moving on to the U.S. Senate. The election, I believe, is going to be November 22nd. Donald, we know some of the candidates, Tim Moore, Leo Daughtry, perhaps Brian Holloway, and others that might be looking at this. Do we think the legislature is going to look much different with the new House Speaker? And if so, how?
It won't look a ton different. It'll look different on specific issues. I think you have to look at some of the front runners or trial lawyers, and so maybe some of the tort reform stuff gets moved around in a different way than it would have under a Tillis-led House. Justin Burr has now thrown his name in the ring. A Justin Burr House will look different, particularly on things like Medicaid reform and Medicaid expansion, probably more conservative than it would under some other people. So it'll be interesting, but on specific issues, not overall.
Yeah, Justin Burr will be a young House Speaker. I think he's only 29 years old.
Yeah.
So.
I agree with Donald on this. I will say this, a person who's really got to take an interest in this race is Governor McCrory. Speaker Tillis protected the governor to a large extent. Donald knows this, I know this, maybe the public doesn't know it, but you had the governor and the speaker holding press conferences together, working on education packages together, and the speaker, the governor, and Phil Berger didn't always see eye to eye. So if you're Governor McCrory, you're wondering who's going to be that person who's going to help me, because he's got to run statewide in 2 years. And Phil Berger is not, his brand of politics, I would argue, is not what the North Carolina voter is ready to vote for.
Is there one of those candidates that you think that would be a closer ally, or is it just too early to tell, or we don't know?
I think it's, I think these races are done behind the scenes. It is the most, and this goes for both political parties, it is one of the most undemocratic processes. We'll see. It's about fundraising. It's about jockeying for there's a lot of horse trading going on.
Yeah.
I imagine Governor McCrory's in those discussions as well. I would hazard that guess.
That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Do you think the House will be more conservative regardless?
I think the House is going to be far more conservative than it was in the past. I think everybody was very timid going into these elections. They thought that Kay Hagan was going to turn the race into a referendum on the General Assembly, which she did. And the people of North Carolina came back with a resounding, we'll take what we're getting out of Raleigh rather than what we're getting out of D.C., where Republicans maintained not just majorities, but super majorities in both the House and the Senate, and Kay Hagan lost. And nobody can argue that this was not a referendum on the General Assembly.
I'd say this, though. I'd say if you're a Wake County Republican and you saw the election returns come in, you have to be wondering what 2016 is going to look like for you. A different electorate's going to be out. You're going to have a strong gubernatorial race. There'll be a strong Democrat. If you're Nelson Dollar, Marilyn Avila, Chris Malone, you're wondering what those numbers are going to look like in 2 years. It might be a moderating factor with some of these suburban districts. But on the whole, I agree. We lost a moderate in Tom Murray. Some would argue he is one. And it's going to have a more conservative effect.
Yeah, we're really becoming a tale of two states with the rural and the urban areas, and what it means for politics is fascinating. The many facets of Medicaid, whether it's expansion or reform or moving DHHS from Medicaid, is that going to be the overarching story, do you think, of the legislative session coming up?
I think reform will probably be the overarching message. There's some talk about expansion. I think that'll go away fairly quickly. There was a pretty devastating poll from the Foundation for Government Accountability that was released today that shows that people in North Carolina, once they get a little bit more information about that Medicaid expansion is part of Obamacare, that they're having to cut Medicare overall to pay for Medicaid expansion, that people just are not in favor of that overall. And I think you're going to see the governor walk away from that. And I don't think that'll be, I think it's probably dead on arrival at the General Assembly.
You agree with that?
I do. I mean, it's all indications is that we're not expanding Medicaid. I think it goes along with this more conservative General Assembly. I think the big question for McCrory and the General Assembly is, are we going to focus on some of these social issues that Senator Berger is fighting recently in the newspaper around Amendment 1 and its application, or are we going to focus on jobs? I think most North Carolinians would like to see the General Assembly focus on jobs. I think tax reform is also another big issue.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating to see what they do with that, and particularly what we see coming with the April returns, no doubt about that. Donald Bryson, Brian Lewis, good to see you guys. Thank you so much. Great job.
Thank you.